right, Aaron. It looks like we have a good group today. So if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and start this workshop, we will get going.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everybody. My name is Aaron Ortiz. I'm with WGR Southwest. I'm a stormwater compliance specialist. I help people out with their stormwater laws, in particular the industrial general stormwater permit. And that's why I'm doing these classes, because this is what I know and this is what I do. I appreciate you all being here today. Now, I will give you a quick note again. This is really, even as it maybe for some, it may feel like it's a lot of information, but believe it or not, this is just as focused as I can make it to fit in all the information needs to be fitted in the short time. There's a lot more to the general permit than what we'll be able to do here today, but this will give you the basics to cover an understanding of what the general permit's all about. So it's 8 o'clock, and for the sake of time, and that the next section starts right at 9 o'clock, so I'd like to end a few minutes early at the end of this one so we can move on and get the second part set up. So I'm going to go ahead and now it's 8 o'clock, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the question is, what is the IGP, the Industrial General Stormwater Permit? So let's get, many times people say, you know, they start a business, especially here in California, like, wait a minute, I got this notification saying, hey, I can't get my business license, you know, that SB 205, you know, I can't get my license, what's going on? What is this all about? So let me give you the dime tour real quick, a quick history of what the IGP, or the Industrial General Stormwater Permit, is all about. Okay, so first of all, why are we here? Let's start with history. In 1948, there was a Federal Pollution Act that came out, and basically it helped to regulate stormwater, but it was really pretty much gutless. It was pretty much had very little teeth. And there was a lot of pollution. There was a lot of things. If you look at the background picture I have, there's a very famous fire on the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, that the river itself kept catching on fire. And so the media came out for an event and it happened to be there and see it, and were able to publicize it. So there had been a lot of outcry. So in the early 70s, after a series of fires and things like that related to the environment, they came out, they revised that law and referred to it as the Clean Water Act. And then 1987, basically they created a framework so that states can create a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES program, to help regulate surface waters in the United States. So one of the things that people need to keep in mind, that this general permit is a surface waters permit, okay? So in the 1990, they came out with some final regulations, and I know in California in 1992, we started the general permit. The general permit is a permit that's general. It's the same for everyone. It's the same document that everybody who requires permit coverage has to have. Now, basically, if you have a standard industrial classification code, an SIC code, that classifies you under the Clean Water Act as a facility that might have a higher chance of polluting the environment. So they want to regulate you, make sure the water doesn't just leave your property and go to the surface waters of the United States. It has to be administered. It has to be monitored, because water that leaves your property goes right to the rivers, streams, all the different surface waters. So that's what this permit does. Is certain businesses, if their standard industrial classification code, their SIC code, categorizes them as a business that needs to have coverage, you can't just let water leave. You have to put certain protections in place, and that's what this permit does. And it gives you general rules, okay? It doesn't say you specifically have to do sweeping 15 times a day or something like that. It says you have to do good housekeeping, and we'll go into that in a minute. But it gives you general rules, and it says from these general rules, you need to apply these, okay? And basically, the Clean Water Act allows for states to seek and get granted the ability to administer their own programs. So that's why you say, wait a minute, this is a Clean Water Act. It's a federal Clean Water Act, but yet I'm under the California Industrial General Stormwater Permit. Why is that? Because the California sought and got authority to administer the general permit program. So what we have now is a California issued general permit that businesses that meet the criteria under the SIC code category are required to get coverage, and the California has a right to administer it. So it's a federal program, so it's a state program with federal backing, okay? And so back in '89, California received approval to administer this program. So the NPDES program created basically the permit that we're under now. And this permit requires you to create a document. So like I said, this is a general permit with general rules. And now here's the thing that people don't understand. Many times when I see stormwater pollution prevention plans created, they basically just take the rules from the general permit, they stick them in their plan and say, here, we do good housekeeping. Well, kind of the whole point of the stormwater pollution prevention plan and monitoring plan is says, here's how we are going to apply those general rules. Because like I said, they don't say you have to sweep 15 times a day. They say you have to clean, you have to do good housekeeping. And then you tell them in your plan how you plan to keep that. It's a general permit, same permit for everybody. So let's get into the thing. So the last fully revised SWEP came out on July 1st of 2015. And then there was significant amendments to that, amendments to this 2015 permit in November of 2018, and it became effective as of July 1st, 2020. So now we have a permit, it's posted on the State Water Board's website, but you'll see across it, it says unofficial draft. Okay, so don't let that fool you. It may be called an unofficial draft, but it is the executive, it is the enforced permit of California. And basically they say they have to, the reason it's not an official permit yet is because they haven't assigned a permit number to it. However, like I said, if you see across it, it says unofficial permit, but it is the enforceable law land for California. So here's what the general permit looks like. And what we're going to focus on is the first half of the two sections. So you can see when I said the permit's huge and it has all these things, we're only going to focus on two sections, section 10 and 11. And right now on this half of training, we're going to talk about section 10, which is the stormwater pollution prevention plan section of the stormwater of the plan. And it's made up of two sections, the plan and the monitoring plan. But first, let's talk about what you're expected to do. So let's take a look at the first part. We're going to focus on section 10. Okay. So best management practices. If you haven't heard that term before, you will. It applies in many different sectors of business, but it's particularly important in terms of industrial general stormwater permit, because here's the official definition as it's found in the attachment C of the general permit. Scheduling of activities, prohibitions and practices, maintenance procedures, and other maintenance practices to prevent or reduce the discharge of pollutants. BMPs also include treatment requirements, operating procedures. You can see the rest of it. I can keep going, but I'm going to put you all to sleep. Bottom line is, I like to put things in terms that I understand. So I would put it this way. BMPs, best management practices, are anything you do or practice, like non-structural, like sweeping or other kinds of practices or procedures, and anything you build to reduce or eliminate pollutants in stormwater discharges. Bottom line, very broad term. So if you have a procedure to how you fuel your vehicles that keeps that from hitting the ground, that's a BMP. If you build a cover to keep water from hitting something, that's a BMP. Very broad term, okay? So what kind of BMPs does this permit? The one that came out in 2015 and then again was revised and the revisions became effective, or the amendments became effective as of July 1st, 2020. You have the minimum BMPs, which most of which are non-structural, and you're required to apply those to the extent feasible. And then you have advanced BMPs. Those are the structural ones that, again, to the extent feasible. And let's take a look. Minimum BMPs consist mostly of non-structural practices under the general permit that are required to be applied to each facility. So you have to apply them to a certain degree. Again, that's what your SWEP does. Your SWEP tells people how you intend to apply these things to your facility. Okay? So, and I use the term extent feasible, so I think we should define that just a little bit. It requires that you implement and maintain to the extent feasible minimum BMPs to reduce or prevent pollutants in industrial stormwater discharges, as well as the advanced BMPs, but right now we're talking about minimal. Okay? Basically, you need, to the extent feasible, as requiring dischargers to select and design and install implement BMPs that reduce or prevent discharges of pollutants in stormwater discharge in a manner that reflects best industry practice, considering technological availability and economic practicability and achievability. So, in other words, what's feasible for one company may not be feasible for another. And see, here's where your SWEP comes into place, your stormwater pollution prevention plan, your SWEP. And it's because you can say, well, you know, for this company, this may be feasible, but they may not be feasible for us. And if you want to make the argument, you need to make it in your SWEP. So how you implement the minimum BMPs needs to meet with what your industry in general is doing and is technologically and economically achievable, okay, available and achievable. So they're not asking you to have a starship come down from outer space and clean your stormwater. I mean, that's not technologically achievable. But you can sweep, you can put berms up, you can put water maybe perhaps through an absorbent channel, or you perhaps can do more. You can cover some areas. You can do practices that don't just spill stuff all over the floor that run off and go down the storm drain. There are things that you can do that don't cost you a great amount of money, but yet are very effective. So let's talk about what many people consider to be the most effective BMP, and that's good housekeeping. Here's the definition as spelled out in the general permit. Observe all outside industrial areas, including potential pollutants from offsite sources for anything that might affect stormwater discharges, to determine how best to clean the areas. Okay, so again, they're not saying you have to sweep 15 times. It doesn't say that. It says you need to keep the place clean. Whether you do sweeping or power washing, as long as you capture and dispose of that wastewater properly, what matters is you got to apply this. And again, that's what your stormwater pollution plan does. It doesn't say, hey, let's carbon copy stuff from the permit and let's go stick it in our permit. Hey, there we have it. No. A lot of these permits say, we do good housekeeping. Well, how? Well, we do good housekeeping. How? Well, that's what you're supposed to say. Well, we sweep. You know, I have one client, actually a former client now, because they're doing it internally, but they worked with cut wood, and for them, they had 3 shifts. And they used to take the last 15 minutes of each shift for everybody in the whole plant just to sweep up and clean up. Now that's to the extreme. I've had other folks where, because of the nature of their business, they only clean up once a week at the end of the week. And so far, everybody's numbers have come out good. So again, you tell in your permit how you intend to apply this. Minimize drag out. So keep stuff from inside, get it outside. Minimize dust generation. Try to keep dust down. People say, hey, you know, everything's covered, but yet they cut stuff or do stuff where it creates these plumes of smoke and materials that floats outside out in the open, settles on the ground, and then washes down the storm drain. Okay? Make sure your exposed equipment or vehicle washing areas are clean. Okay, so basically, if you clean areas outside, if you do any kind of washing, that area has to be clean when you're done. You can't just leave. You can't just wash it and say, well, this isn't going down. It's not a discharge. Remember, by the way, as a reminder, this is a discharge permit. If water doesn't leave your property, it's not a discharge. It has to leave your property or go into a drain that leaves your property for it to be a discharge. So if you have an area where water builds up and you capture it, it doesn't leave, that's not a discharge. And that's critical to later on, especially in Section 2, we'll talk a lot about this. Okay, so if you have areas, for example, some people say, well, I wash my equipment, my vehicles outside, but it's on this concrete pad, it's captured, doesn't go anywhere. That might be the case, but the permit still requires you that when you wash an area, when you're done, you got to clean it up. Because if we have some heavy storms like we experienced back in 16, 17, I know that was a very heavy stormwater year where water really came in. Areas that wouldn't normally discharge, if you have heavy storm season, that will eventually wash off and go down the storm drain. So if you have exposed areas with vehicle washing or cleaning, you got to clean those areas up when you're done. You can't just leave them, because the whole point is they're going to make sure that that doesn't go off the storm, leave down the storm drain. Cover all stored materials that might mobilize pollutants during a storm event. What just makes sense. As a business, you want to try to keep things from leaving your property that you use. Contain stormed non-solid materials or wastes, particulates, powder, shredded paper, and so forth, that can be blown in the wind or washed away by the storm. So basically, they want you, the whole point of the permit, especially when 2015 came out, is they want people to think through their process, think through this. How can we, ahead of time, prepare for and keep things from going? I have a couple of clients who have sulfur, and many of them one uses retaining walls that basically are up against the prevailing wind, so that it helps to stop that. One actually has a huge containment wall all around their facility. They choose similar but different BMPs to help keep the sulfur from flying off in the wind. Prevent wash water from getting down to the storm drain and runoff. Okay, yes, that's a BMP, but it's also an illicit discharge if you let wash water wash down the storm drain. That's an illicit discharge, and you can get in some serious problems for that. Minimize runoff from non-industrial areas to industrial areas. Okay, the theory behind this is that they're saying that where you do industrial activity, you're most likely going to have a lot more pollutants that are present. So what they want you to do is try to minimize areas that are non-industrial, like, well, even though I consider parking lots to be just as dirty as other places, areas that have little industrial activity from washing through it, and all that water washing into areas that do have industrial activity, and then the theory is they're worried that you're going to have this water have to wash stuff off and go down storm drain. So if you can, again, to the extent practicable, to the extent feasible, if you can minimize non-stormwater areas or non-industrial areas from washing through in your industrial areas and adding more water runoff to that area. Minimize authorized non-stormwater discharges. Okay, so there's a term we use, it's called only rain down the drain, and for the most part that'd be nice, but it's not practical, and they also know that there are certain types of non-stormwater that are allowed to leave. Irrigation being one of them, but there's always strings attached, by the way. It's always something you have to make sure it can't just leave polluted. There's a lot of caveats they add to that. So what they're saying is non-stormwater, yes, there's certain types of non-stormwater, fire suppression water, irrigation, potable water, different things that are allowed to leave as long as it leaves relatively clean. But even though it's allowed to leave, they still want you to minimize it to the extent feasible. Okay. I'd love to go into more detail, but I just can't because we're under a time crunch. Identify and determine all stationary facility or mobile equipment and systems used outdoors that may spill or leak. So again, they want you to think through your program. That's kind of the whole point, that when the permit came out in 2015, they want people to no longer just they want you to try to think through your program ahead of time. So what do we have outside? What could possibly have pollutants? What can possibly cause an issue? And what we do is, when you think through that, okay, now let's determine what can we do that may cause a leak, okay? And they're not talking about things like, well, we had an asteroid from out. No, we're talking about normal activity. What's feasible, okay? What can feasibly cause an issue? And that's, so we went from good housekeeping to preventative maintenance now. That's the second of your non-structural BMPs. Okay, now that we have the determination of what's out there, and we look at, well, what's feasible, what can cause a leak. Then they want you to perform appropriate scheduled maintenance. Okay, why? Because the theory is, if you have equipment, you want to keep it maintained, it's less likely to bust and get polluted all over the place. Quick example, I have a client and that had a whole bunch of old forklifts. I mean, a bunch of them, and they're really old. And this former client's idea of proper maintenance was, when the hydraulic hose busts on these things, throw duct tape on it and get to it later. Okay, that was, let's just say, that's the way it felt. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but that's the way it felt. Okay, so his yard was completely just full of hydraulic oil from all these old forklifts, and their hydraulic hoses just cracking and breaking. And so a new manager came in from out of state, and he saw this mess and says, "Oh no, this is not appropriate." And so, believe it or not, the previous manager was not actually following proper preventive maintenance because he was not performing appropriate scheduled maintenance. Okay. Now, again, appropriate is a judgment call on your part, but having hydraulic oil all over the floor from all these forklifts that aren't working, that would be considered inappropriate by most of the regulatory bodies. So what happened was, the manager came in, he got a forklift repair company to come in and service all the forklifts, which was kind of a pretty penny because it hadn't been done before on a facility-wide manner, and got all the forklifts up to specs, got all the hoses changes, got everything done, and then he got them on a quarterly maintenance program. Okay, now the yard looks pristine compared to what it used to. I don't see hydraulic drips almost anywhere. The water quality is dramatically improved simply by performing appropriate scheduled maintenance. Okay, so that's one example I use. So again, you see there at the bottom of the list, develop procedures. You'll see that a lot again. Think through your process, have something written down, develop procedures. Okay, spill and leak prevention and response. Okay, this is a 2-for-1 special. The first half is the optimistic side, spill and leak prevention. Okay, so how can we keep spills or leaks from happening? Develop procedures and or controls to minimize spills and leaks. Okay, now here comes the other half, and this is the reality section, and response. Because life happens, spills happen, you do everything you can. That's why they want you to think through your program, develop procedures, try to do things to minimize spills or leaks. But then sometimes it happens. So that's why you have the second one, train appropriate staff on spill prevention and response. You'll notice the word appropriate a lot because, again, this is a general permit. They want you to think through your program and apply it as is feasible for your facility. Make sure you have appropriate spill response material equipment. So I had a former client where they have stored batteries in one section. They have a lot of maintenance of oil in another section. So the maintenance oil, they have tons of spill dry type stuff, K-liter type absorbents that work really well for that section. But where the stored batteries or used batteries where they're recycling, those things leak a lot, and that has sulfuric acid solution on the ground, and that's just not appropriate just to use K-liter type absorbent. So what they did was they got some different types of materials that would help to neutralize the acid and then clean it up properly. So what's appropriate for each facility, that you have to determine. What do we have? Again, think through your process. What do we have, and how can we properly respond to the type of spill that might happen in this area? Material handling and waste management. Okay, here's where you become as much an expert and more of an expert than I am. Okay, how do you handle business? So prevent or minimize handling of industrial materials or waste that can really mobilize by contact stormwater during a storm event. So they want you to think through, okay, how are we doing our business, and how can we do it in such a manner that we keep this stuff from getting into stormwater? Okay, and so no one knows your business like you do. So think through your process. Okay, I had one client where they had covered areas, and they're different things, but they went from one extreme covered area through an open courtyard to another covered area to transport stuff. And basically all they had to do was move a process next to each other so that it wasn't exposed to stormwater. And so they did that, and they not only did they have a more streamlined business, but they also kept their stuff from being exposed to stormwater. So how do you handle your materials? How are we doing things? How can we make it so that it's not just efficient, which is, for most businesses that's paramount, but also how can we keep it from coming in contact with stormwater? And then you'll see that this next one gave a lot of facilities heartburn because it's kind of a blanket statement. Cover industrial waste disposal containers and industrial material storage containers that contain industrial materials when not in use. By the way, some of this wording may sound a little confusing or redundant to you. My apologies, but I pull it directly out of the general permit and I put it in the training, so you can see exactly what the permit is asking for. So basically, after 2015, I noticed that a lot of people who had those giant 40-yard bins, those giant dumpsters, all of a sudden started ordering dumpsters that had the covers on it. Because now, if you close or if you stop your production, that's when not in use. Therefore, it needs to be covered when not in use. So a lot of people were like, well, can I use a tarp? You can. But again, sometimes if it rains, the tarp's going to fall in. So you need to come up with solutions. Some people just park I have one client who took their dumpster they had, and they park it underneath they had like an overhang where they kept equipment. At night, they just shove their thing underneath that overhang, but it's not in use. So how you apply it, as long as it's covered when not in use, that's what matters. Erosion and sediment control. Okay, when the 2015 and then again revised in 2020, when it came out, it put a lot more emphasis on erosion control, because I had some clients, some facilities, they're industrial, but they look like construction sites because they do aggregates for different construction sectors. So many times their facility looks almost more like an ongoing construction site than an actual industrial business. So it falls under the industrial category. So again, they want you to think through your process. So implement effective wind and rain erosion controls. So what's effective? Well, you're again, just like with the material handling, you tell me, how do you think this is effective in keeping the wind from blowing stuff away or the rain from washing it away? Maintain effective perimeter controls and stabilize all site entrances and exits to sufficiently control discharging erodible materials. So they want you to basically look around, okay, walk around your site, take a look at it. Okay, are we controlling the perimeter? Is water coming in or is it leaving? Because basically, wherever water leaves your property, that becomes a point of discharge, or what we used to call outfalls. I use the term outfall, even though it's technically supposed to be water going to the ocean. But basically, I use the term for the point of discharge and the word outfall interchangeably. So forgive me if I fall into that. But regardless, when you walk over the perimeter, if water leaves your front gate, that's an outfall or a point of discharge. If water leaves through a section of your yard, that's an outfall. And if you have an outfall, if you have a point of discharge, you're required to collect samples when it rains during a storm. So take a look at your perimeters. Do you have perimeter controls? Are your controls in place? If you have berms around, are your berms been breached? You know, has a heavy piece of equipment breached your berm? Does it mean that's part of your monthly inspections, which we'll talk about in section or part 2. So that's why we tell people when they do monthly inspections, which again we'll talk about in part 2, this is reasonable. They need to do a perimeter check for this right here, and make sure that stuff that's inside isn't getting tracked outside. I had some clients where, because again they supply aggregate to construction sites, many times they have a lot of aggregate things, and stuff gets tracked out of their property. I have one client where they have this long driveway, and at the far end of the driveway they put in a mandatory truck car wash where everybody who leaves has to go through that car wash, the tire wash, on the way out. And so the tire wash, they pull in, they wash their tires, and they leave, and then they have this nice, 100 feet plus area where the water has a chance to drip off and leave their property. So that's how they chose to control track out from their facility. Now, how you control track out, as long as it's working for you, that's what matters. Some people do rumble strips, some people have cattle gates, which is very effective type things. However it works, as long as it works, that's what matters. Employee training program, okay? For those of you who have joined us and are joining us, congratulations, you are actually fulfilling the general permit requirement now. Pollution prevention team members, such as facility personnel or contractors implementing these various compliance groups, basically, you need to be appropriately and properly trained. The term properly was added in 2015, okay? Okay, so again, the same, and basically they tell you, in being properly trained, some of the things that permit list is, well, you have to know about the BMPs, you have to know how to grab samples. That's why I broke this training up into 3 parts. So that way, all the parts that need to be covered that the requires you to have for training are going to be covered in, especially parts 1 and 2 of this training. So as a side note, if you go to level 1 for any sampling parameter, the permit requires that your pollution prevention team be trained by a qualified industrial store practitioner, a QUIS, someone with my credential, okay? And we'll talk about that more in part 2. So you need to be trained, and you need to be appropriately trained and properly trained. Quality assurance and record keeping. Develop or implement management or tracking procedures to ensure that appropriate staff implements all elements. In other words, does everybody understand what's in their SWEP, their stormwater pollution prevention plan, and are they doing what they're expected to do? Okay. Maintain records. You're supposed to keep it up to a minimum of 5 years and have it readily available. So if a regulator walks up, or someone like from the state or whatever who's authorized to do inspections, you need to be able to present it to them and say, here's our records upon request. Now let's talk about advanced BMPs. So we talked about the non-structural BMPs, good housekeeping, material handling, spill response and control, different things like that. Now let's talk about more of the structural side. So now again, I'm kind of flying through this quite a bit. So well, they give us a little space at the end for questions or things, but I want to make sure that we have a handle, okay? Advanced BMPs are the mostly structural BMPs that are required to the extent feasible, and we talked about what they mean by that, okay? So what's feasible? Well, again, in your stormwater pollution prevention plan, you need to tell them, well, here's what's feasible for us to do. So 1, exposure minimization. Exposure minimization includes things to prevent the contact of stormwater and industrial materials or industrial work areas. So roofs, storm resistant shelters, things that keep the weather from coming into contact with your materials. And this is very effective. If you can get everything, all your industrial activity under cover, you can file for a no exposure certification, which would minimize the monitoring that you have to do. If you can get an NEC status where you do all your industrial activity, that includes loading and unloading and storage, all that stuff, if you get that under cover, then you can get NEC status, and basically all you have to do is confirm annually that that status hasn't changed, and there's a much less minimum permit fee that goes with it. It's much less than your standard notice of intent coverage. Stormwater containment and discharge reduction BMP. This is one of my favorite ones. And why is that? Because it's a containment and discharge of reduction BMPs include diverting, infiltrating, and percolating, reusing, or in some way containing or reducing the volume of water runoff. Okay, so basically what they're saying is, some people say, well, as you'll see in the next one, we talk about treatment control. Under this permit that we have now, if you're going to call something a treatment control, which is biologically, mechanically, or in some way cleaning water in those manners. Again, I can't go into much detail with the time we have here. But if you can capture or even slow it down, it helps to a certain degree treat water. You may not be able to call it a treatment control because it doesn't meet that 85th percentile 24-hour storm standard that's outlined in the permit. But yet they still say in the language, we still encourage you to do it. Why? Because a little is better than nothing at all. I have some clients where they have a couple of series of small ponds. Altogether, it doesn't meet that treatment control standard that's outlined in Section X.H.1.f, but it still minimizes the amount of stormwater that leaves their property. It still minimizes the amount of discharges they have, and so that they have 1 to 2, maybe not necessarily. We'll talk about in Section 2 about how many stormwater samples you're supposed to collect. But many times this helps them to reduce the amount of water that actually leaves their property. It gives them a chance to capture some of it, settle out solids. Some people that actually just having some basic treatment type style, but don't meet the criteria, but that kind of thing actually helps to clean the water to the point where their numbers are really, really good. So that's why the Water Board realizes if you can't put in a treatment control as outlined in Section 10H6, feel free. In fact, they encourage you to do something because something is better than nothing. And we found that many times just running water over a vegetative area, besides helping to reduce the number of discharges, also helps to keep the water cleaner. So now let's talk about treatment controls. Treatment control BMPs include putting into place mechanically, chemically, or biologically treat stormwater. Okay. For a BMP to be considered a treatment control BMP, it must meet with the design standards outlined in Section 10H6 of the general permit. Okay. So one thing I like about this is I don't have to be an engineer because they expect an engineer to be the one to certify this. So I can, if a client wants to put in a BMP, say they put in a pond. And I said, okay, if you could build a pond to this standard, you really need to do that, because that way it will really help in terms of a response, especially if you go to a level 1 or level 2, because, and we'll talk about that in the next one. But basically, if you go to level 2 or something, the permit expects you to do more than just, well, we do more extra sweeping, or we do just. They want you to do more to try to control that. Okay. So the BMP must be certified by a California licensed professional engineer in accordance with, and then they have the references. Okay. So you see, the good thing about a treatment control BMP is if someone builds something to meet that criteria standard, I'm not the one that makes that judgment call. In fact, not even the client, it's the engineer that says, okay, this treatment control BMP meets this standard. And once you have the certification from the professional engineer, then you can put in your plan as, yes, this is a treatment control BMP. And finally, boy, we really flew through this pretty quickly, faster than I expected. If you have any additional BMPs not described, so for example, what would be a other advanced BMP? Well, a lot of our clients use a product called Filtrex. It's a compost media material used to filter stormwater. Again, it doesn't meet that 85th percentile 24-hour storm criteria for filtering stormwater to meet that criteria, but yet it does do a certain amount of filtration and a certain amount of blocking or filtering out of solids and things. So that would be in the other category. So things of that nature, things that don't quite fit in the other categories you mentioned above. So it looks to me like I raced through this really fast, and we're coming up to the end of the slides. So Rebecca, do we have any chat questions we can address?
There are no questions in the chat, but people were having a problem logging on to our website. And I just want to let you know the website is back up. It was temporarily down. So you can go ahead and log on and download resources or their certificate of training or register for the other classes right now.
Wow, okay. Well, then let me just do a quick recap. So general permit came out, Clean Water Act came out in 72. Eventually we got the NPDES program, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Program. From that, basically facilities that are under the Industrial General Stormwater Permit under the SIC code that require permit coverage, you're required to not let water just leave your property, but you have to have certain controls in place, BMPs, okay? And California administers this. So it's a federal program with the state, it's a state program with federal backing. And what we have to do is you have to develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan. And that plan tells you how you intend to follow these general rules that are outlined in the general permit. And so we talked about the different aspects of the BMPs that need to be done. Basically, you have to do good housekeeping, you have to do preventative maintenance, you have to do material handling properly, you have to do erosion control, you have to, those are different aspects of it that you're required. Again, I mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. When you develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan, a SWEP, many times, like I said, I've seen it before, where someone just takes the rules of the permit and they just put it in the SWEP and say, hey, we do good housekeeping. Well, that's kind of not the point. The point is you tell them how you intend to do good housekeeping. That's the point of the SWEP. We intend to sweep, or we have a mechanical sweeper that comes out. Now, one thing I will suggest, if you do have, for example, say your facility opts to use a vacuum sweeper, like a street sweeper come by, sometimes during the year you use it less than other times of the year, depending on the weather and different things. So if you put in your stormwater pollution plan, hey, we use this street sweeper once a month, well then that becomes, if you put that in your SWEP and that's what you do, that becomes law to you. And so you're going to be expected to do that once a month. And if you don't, you're actually violating the BMPs in your SWEP. So what I recommend is give yourself some flexibility. If you know you're going to have fluctuality in when you have to do it as opposed to not do it, then I would say something like, you know, we utilize a street sweeper as deemed necessary by facility management. You're not trying to get around, you're not trying to be, like a politician where you're trying to double speak, but you're giving yourself the flexibility to apply it as needed. So again, so you have the permit, you have management practices you're required to do, and those management practices required to do are spelled out in section 10 of the general permit, and then you have to apply those. Now again, I flew through this really quick because I'm trying to judge the time to make sure I got all that in. Now we're gonna go at 9 o'clock, we have the part 2, and I'm really going to have to race through that one because we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts. We're going to talk about what you're expected to do. You're supposed to grab samples, okay? How much you're going to grab samples? What are we looking for? All those questions are coming up, and those are good legitimate questions because what one client grabs a sample for may not be what another one. So I know I'm kind of dipping into section 2, but if you have industrial activities that produce a certain pollutant or potential pollutant that you know about, you have to include that in your sampling because you have to make an assessment of what potential pollutants are out there. You can't just say, hey, well, we have a sample, we're not going to sample for it. If you know it's potentially there, you need to look for it. And especially after 2015, things were ramped up, and then when the amendments came that were ratified in 2018, they became effective as of July 1st, 2020. There's a lot of ramifications. And one of the things that we're going to talk about are, besides numeric action levels, NALs, we're going to talk about TNALs, total, which are TMDL based NALs, and we'll talk about that. And also NELs, which are numeric effluent limits. Okay, so as of the July 1st, 2020, we now have limits applied to this permit, and they're different from NALs. And if a lot of the people that I work with here in the San Joaquin Valley and up here in Northern California, a lot of those NELs don't apply to you yet. But in Southern California, a lot of NELs do apply to you. and some of them are extremely rigid or sensitive. So our Southern California office out of Los Alamitos, they have a lot of experience in dealing with the compliance actions and the NELs. And they'd be a great, if you're down there in the LA area and anything south of the so where NELs are effective, they'd be a great resource to help you out with that.
Hi,
Okay,
Aaron.
so yes,
We
ma'am.
have a couple questions.
Good.
So let me see. The first question is, who typically enforces the IGP? Is it the state or local municipality?
Unless I sound like a politician, both. Okay. The state has the state water resources control board, and it's broken down into 9 regions. Okay. I'm here in Lodi, which is under Region 5, Sacramento region, and Section 5 actually has 3 regions. You have the Redding, Sacramento, and you have the Fresno regions. Okay. So the Regional Water Quality Control Board is usually the arm of the water board that goes out and does inspections and things like that. So they do enforcement, yes. However, under the Clean Water Act, you also have cities, the municipalities that have a multi-sector permit. In other words, a permit for cities or small municipalities, okay? And in their multi-sector permit, they're required to do inspections of facilities that are under general permit coverage. So you could be inspected by the state, but you could also be inspected by people who come from an MS4, whether it's a county or a city, or in like the case of like the Port of Stockton, they have their own MS4, a small municipality, because they're required under their permit to do inspections and enforcement of the general permit. So to answer your question, they both do. The state, usually through the regional boards, do inspections, but also your local municipality who has an MS4 also do inspections.
Awesome. And then we have a question from Sherry who asked, can we discard our old permit?
Can you discard your whole permit?
Can you get rid of the old permit because of the new one?
I'm not exactly sure the nature of the question. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it. Perhaps you can give me a little more details what you mean by that.
Sherry, if you want to clarify that for us, go ahead and put it in the chat. That'd
be great. But I can say while we're waiting for clarification, there was a permit that was out there for 18 years, and as of July 1st of 2015, that became no longer effective, and then the new permit came out with a lot. It was vastly updated. Then from there, in 2018, they had some serious amendments to the 2015 permit that became effective as of July 1st, 2020. So if the general permit, like Mary, I talked about the SIC code, if you're listed in attachment A of the general permit saying you need to have permit coverage, you have 3 types of coverage. You can do an NOI, which is notice of intent, which means we have to have full coverage because we discharge and we need to have permit coverage. Or if you can cover everything, which I mentioned before, which is an NEC, which is a no exposure certification, then you can apply for NEC coverage and basically just annually say, look, we're still covered, we don't have exposure, and just pay that annual fee. Now, you can get out of the general permit altogether. You can discard or get out of the general permit altogether if you can build something that can handle what the NONA requirements, known as notice of non-applicability. Most of the time, that means a pond that's so big that it can handle all the storms in history for your facility and a series of storms leading up to the largest storm in history. If you can build a pond or something that can handle the NONA requirements, then you can get out of the general permit. Or if all your water, which is rare, if all your storm water will go to, it can handle going to a sanitary sewer, or a POTW, public owned treatment works, and you can show that your facility can handle that and meet those criteria, you can actually file for and get a NONA, and then you're out of the permit altogether.
Awesome. And then we have a question from Chris, who said, if a facility has several discrete discharge areas where discharge is controlled and sampled, then a small amount of runoff going out the front gate as surface flow. Should we add a representative sampling reduction justification to the SWIP for this area so we don't have to sample, or do we just need to sample?
That's a great question. Technically speaking, the permit says if water leaves your property, you're supposed to grab a sample. If possible, if you could redirect that to one of your outfalls, that'd be best. However, there are some folks that say that there's such a minimal amount of discharge, it's not feasible for them to grab samples because it's just an entrance, and they go with that. So I know I'm not giving you the really best answer, but if you can capture and redirect that, I would, if at all possible, rather than have a whole another sampling point. But yeah, that's my approach I would take. First of all, try to redirect it if you can. If it's a very, very small amount, you can make the argument that, hey, we have a sample that's representative of this discharge, and you can put it in your SWEP and try to say, hey, this is representative of our discharge. Which permit allows, if you, as long as the surface area that where you grab your sample is identical to your outfall. In other words, if water leaves your front gate, the water is identical to another outfall, and you can make the argument that the industrial activities and BMPs and everything are the same, then you can use a representative sampling. The permit allows that. So that I'll leave that to your best judgment. Some people have such a large area that leaves their property, they say it's just not feasible for us. Many people will put a burn to redirect water. So again, your first best option is to try to redirect water, try to have it so that it goes from one spot if at all possible. If you have a large area and the BMPs and the industrial activities in that area are different from other areas of your facility, then you may have to actually make another outfall because it's too different for you to say that it's representative.
Awesome. And we have a question from Danny who says, in Section 10.H.1 of the permit, it lists various minimum BMPs. Is the facility responsible for having all of these applied, or can some of these minimum BMPs be listed in the SWIP as not applicable if it doesn't apply to the facility process at the, or the industrial process at the facility?
Here's where the term to the extent feasible comes in. And so if you say this is not feasible and here's why, and you can make the argument and it passes what they call the red face, what we call the red face test. In other words, really this is not feasible for us and here's why. If you can make that argument, then you would. For example, some people say, hey, all this area, this water area is captured, but we're still supposed to do good housekeeping. Well, you're still required to do housekeeping regardless. But how you do it and how much you do it, that's up to you. Again, the permit tells you need to do it to the extent feasible. So in the argument, like you said, in your SWEP, that's what the stormwater pollution plan is all about. In your SWEP, if you can make the argument that this minimum BMP is not feasible and it stands up to scrutiny, you're fine. So, but you still need to address it in your SWEP. You need to say, this is why this is not feasible, or this, here's how we plan to do this on a minimal scale.
Perfect. Well, I don't see any more questions, and we're going to wrap up early so that we can jump on the next Zoom call. Erin, could you give your contact information? Looks like we just had a question pop in looking for that. So if you want to give that, people can contact you through this. You can also join Aaron for his next 2 parts of this workshop. So there is one at 9 o'clock, which is IGP Basics Part 2, and at 11 o'clock is Part 3. And you can register for those if you have not already on the website. And you can join again via Zoom. And if you miss any portion of this workshop or miss the next 2, you can find those recordings up on our website in about 24 to 48 hours. We'll have those posted. And we have a whole bunch of other workshops, so be sure to check out our schedule for today. And thank you so much for joining us. We will have resources from Aaron's workshop available on our website. I just saw that question from you, Janet. The PowerPoint handouts, everything is on our resources page. So you can head over to there, and that's stormwaterawareness.org. So thank you, Aaron. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you all for joining me today. I look forward to seeing many of you in the next workshop coming up at 9 o'clock.
All right. See you in the next workshop.